Some leaders leave footprints, others leave libraries. You're tuning into the Authors on Mission podcast, where industry giants become literacy legends. In every episode, we talk with authors who turn their brilliance into books that transform lives. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Welcome to your authorship experience. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Authors on Mission podcast. Today, we're joined by Simon Fanshawe, whose journey from pioneering gay rights activist to diversity consultant shows us really unique insights into building effective coalitions for change. He has an amazing book out there called The Power of Difference, which challenges conventional thinking about diversity and inclusion. He has an amazing approach to, show us different values rather than merely just tolerating them. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our guest today. Welcome, Simon. It's a great honor to have you on our show today.
Well, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and it's amazing to think, just right off the bat, here we are into different sides of the world right now, and we're here to talk about the book and the writing process. And, it's just amazing, this day and age, we're able to connect in this way. It's incredible that we were able to do that.
Great, isn't it?
So, I'd like to start a little bit, if you don't mind, just kind of giving our audience a little bit of a background about who you are and sort of, how you came into the position you are now. And, by the end of it also, what inspired you to start writing your book?
Well, there's an old Lerner and Lowe who wrote musicals, the My Fair Lady, and a load of them. They were once asked which comes first, the words or the tune, and they said the check. So not that you get paid in advance any longer for books, but actually I was simply asked to write a book. But the reason I said yes, I guess, is interesting because I've grown up in the UK. My dad was in the army. I grew up as I'm a posh boy, I went to private schools, my parents lived abroad. So, and that's why I went to boarding school and whatever. So I grew up with a set of assumptions, really. But I think also growing up gay, there's something, in and of itself, it's not terribly interesting or important, but it does mean that you go through a process of working out who you were in terms of who you thought you were. And I think one of the interesting things about that is it puts you very slightly outside things. Now, some people's response to that is then to join. I'm not a great joiner. I love community and I really value the sense of togetherness. But actually, as I've gone through life, I've realized that what's more important to me is the discovery of difference than the discovery of similarity. And so I've always had this slight I've never felt affectionate about the gay community, or, I've never felt wholly that I belong to this thing, because it felt to me like the point of fighting for kind of gay equality or equal rights or whatever was so we could shut up about it. It wasn't so we could go on and on and on about it. And my mother once said to me, she said to me, darling, why do you have to make so much noise about it? And I said, so one day we don't have to. So I've always been keen, to get progress, to acknowledge progress, and to find how we do it. So that's one element which I think does come from that bit of my back. It's my reaction to that process of growing up gay and then coming out and then whatever. I also started doing comedy in 1981. So I did 10 years worth of stand-up. People tell me I was the first out gay stand-up in Britain. I'm not sure that means anything. What is interesting about it is that it was possible to do that. So at the point at which I did it, funny enough, I had coffee today with a very old friend of mine who was one of the first people I ever wrote comedy with, and he helped me write my very first routines. Old chum, Kim Fuller, lovely man. And he was saying, you were, and he said, you were the first one to be brave and whatever. I said, no, I wasn't brave at all. I didn't think about it. You just kind of did it. And I think that's what was interesting about the 80s, was that you kind of could do it. The emergence of all those gay networks and whatever, and the emergence of a certain degree of kind of, I don't like to call it pride, really, a sense of sort of self-worth, let's call it. That was very valuable, and that meant that one could do it. And if the 60s, if I could sing and I was musical, I would have been in a band, but as it turns out, I'm funny, so I became a comic. And so I did that for 10 years, but it's an interesting decade in Britain. And this tells you something about why I get to where I get in the book, is that for us, so the gays are been decriminalized in 1967. So when we got to 1981, that, you know, you could go lesbian hiking, you know, and you could go gay beekeeping and all that kind of stuff. And in fact, I had a great American friend who couldn't work out how to come out to his grandmother, who was a rather severe and grand East Coast aristocratic American woman. And I remember he said to her one day, trying to tell her that he was gay, he said, well, next weekend, Gran, I'm going yachting with the Gay Yachting Association. There was a long pause and she looked down her nose at him and she said, can't they yacht with anybody else? Of course, the truth of it is they would have been thrown overboard back in the day, you know. So my point being that, you know, it was possible. And then the 80s came and then AIDS came. And so at the beginning of that decade, in the 80s, the first person to die of AIDS in Britain died in 1981. And so we had this enormous upswing of entrepreneurialism in community terms and in economic terms, but also a decade of stigma. And when we got to the end of the decade, in 1989, well, 87, the government attached to a particular bill, I won't go into the detail, but it was basically an anti-gay bill. It prohibited the discussion of lesbians and gays in public service. That was kind of what it was about. And we decided to mount a campaign about it. And as a result of the campaign, which we lost, by the way, we realized we wanted to start this organization in Britain, the civil rights organization that had the ability to lobby Parliament. Here's the key thing about it. In 1989, if you'd walked along the streets in Britain and said, do you think gays are a jolly good thing? About 80% of people would have said no. So it was a stupid question to ask. The question you could ask, though, was to say to people, do you think it's right that a group of people should be discriminated against as a group by society and by the law? And lots of people would say yes, even people, by the way, who had a very hostile view to homosexuality. And, you know, even religious people, I mean, most religions have a section of their believers who are pretty hostile to lesbians and gays, but even they know what it's like to be discriminated as a group. If you're a Muslim or a Jew or a Catholic or a Protestant, you know about that. So what I learned from that, and I've really carried that over into the work on diversity, is that when you're at work or you're in an organization, you have what I call the bigger principle. In the gay context of Stonewall, it was equality, not do you like gays, but equality. And at work, your bigger principle is whatever you're doing, producing pizzas or publishing books or whatever the hell it is. That's all you've got in common. So the diversity, the strength of this is that you don't have to agree with each other. You have to be able to collaborate with each other. And that's true of all strong communities and organizations, is they're not made up of people who agree with each other. They're made up of people who recognize each other's difference and through that difference can collaborate towards a common objective. And that's been incredibly powerful to me as a lesson. So we started Stonewall in 1989. I did my bit on the board and started, then I left, other people took it on, etc. But in 2014, we had equal marriage. And there were all those things, the armed forces, fostering and adoption, civil partnerships, eventually gay marriage. All that was achieved by building these very broad coalitions. So the reason I wrote the book was to say to people in diversity, stop trying to get everybody to agree with you. Stop trying to impose a single LGBT view or a single view of the significance of race or whatever it might be. Stop trying to do that. What you need to do is recognize the diversity of viewpoint in organizations and use that as a way of collaborating in pursuit of a common aim. Hence the title of the book, The Power of Difference, and hence my approach to diversity and inclusion, which is all about difference, is right at the center of it, not similarity. So that's kind of how I got where I got. And I wrote the book because a really lovely person at Kogan Page, the publishers, asked me to write the book. And she was fantastic. Lucy, she was the best editor ever. So I'm able to say that quickly.
Well, I want to thank you so much for kind of giving us that whole backstory, because that allows our listeners to really get a good idea of who you are. And also, you know, as you were talking to, just the way you wove your humor into that too. It's really great how you naturally do that, you know, and just talking about yourself. So I can see how that really resonated with, you know, the book itself and also your work outside of the book too. It's an amazing approach, you know, kind of like breaking down the barriers by adding a little bit of lighthearted humor in there. I think that's amazing.
Well,
And
it's kind of you to sort of pick up on that, but one of the things about it is that at the moment, in this world of diversity and inclusion, I mean, people are just walking on eggshells. Everybody's terrified. They're all nervous, they're all unsure, they're all uneasy. And most people who do what I do show up at these events, these conferences, these work trainings, whatever it is, and they sort of wag their finger at people. And then everybody gets kind of told off for being male or white or whatever. This is terrible. I mean, I begin most of the sessions I do now at conferences and other things by apologizing. I said, I'm really sorry. You could be out making pizzas or publishing books or whatever the hell it is you do. Instead, you're locked in a room with a gay man for half an hour who's going to tell you what you can and can't say. This is awful. Poor you, And of course, people laugh. But what it does is it signals to them, this is very human. This is going to be an open discussion. We can all laugh, we can contribute, we can, explore what we don't understand about each other and then find some things that we've got in common. So I'm always anxious to try and do anything to sort of defuse the anxiety and tension around this stuff.
yeah, I mean, I understand what you mean by that completely. And, sort of, relating it back to the book and the words in your book, I guess it would be fair to say that within the book, you also incorporated that humor too.
There are jokes.
Yeah, there you go.
People don't expect in the book about diversity. Yeah, they don't expect it.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, that's what's important, especially when you translate that into the written word and you're trying to get your message out, in the form of a book is, ensuring there's ways like that to kind of diffuse the tension, as you said, and also getting your message across. I feel like that's probably a difficult balance almost, trying to relate the serious information along with, sort of more of that lighthearted aspect. Did you find that as a challenge when you were writing?
It's not really a challenge in the sense that it's kind of my natural way of expressing myself. But what is, I think, really interesting is what happens with humor at work. So people are very nervous at the moment of humor at work. And, humor is an odd thing. When you're a stand-up, it's a very curious idea that you can say something and then 500 or 1,000 people will all laugh at the same time at it. That is really odd, and it's a physiological reaction. It's a very peculiar thing that we do as humans. Now, therefore, it's very bonding, but the very nature of it being bonding may also be very excluding. So at work, it's actually potentially quite dangerous. So we all know that when you go to a new job and there's a shared joke that everybody else has got and you haven't got it, it's to start with. Now, I'm not saying don't laugh at work, for goodness sake, I'm not saying that. You have to be careful, not in the sense of, oh dear, super sensitive. You just have to be embracing of people. And sometimes not everybody laughs and sometimes they do. But what happens at the moment is that all those kind of, whether it's laughter, the expression of opinions, the expression of particular views or coming from a particular direction, all of those things can be then, people's reaction to them can be very judgmental in the sense that they can penalize you for it. So, you'll say something and they go, I mean, I've literally heard people say, you can't say that as a gay man. Well, I just did. I'm a gay man and I just said it. Turns out I can say it. What you mean is you don't agree with it. And so humor, you have to be careful with humor. It needs to come from a place of warmth. And it needs to come from a place of engagement. Equally, I do love quite a lot of comics whose warmth I feel, but they are deliberately provocative and on the surface divisive, but they know what they're doing. And that's the other thing I say to people at work. There's so much stand-up around these days. People sit on television the whole time, HBO, blah, 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 all these specials and Netflix specials and so on and so forth. You have to be really careful at work because the thing that you don't recognize at work is you're not a stand-up. And when you're a stand-up, when you make a joke that is potentially edgy or divisive, you know what you're doing. Unless you're crass. I mean, there are some people who they don't know what they're doing. So they're just crass and I don't like them. But the people who are clever at it are playing with the tension and they know how to do it. And the reason they know how to do it is they've done it time and time and time and time again. So they know what that comedy muscle is. They've exercised that comedy muscle. Don't do that at work. Don't suddenly think, I can be the stand-up and I'll do the edgy joke because that'd be great, because you're not in control of it and they're not an audience. And by the way, they didn't pay to see you. So there are all sorts of, there's sort of cautionary notes, but don't lose your sense of humor. You know, for goodness sake, don't lose your sense of humor, because that is a way of getting on with other people. It's a way of signaling that you're on the same wavelength. So it's a really interesting thing, humor, and how you use it, the effect that it has.
Yeah, so branching off of what you were talking about, regarding balancing comedy in the workplace, I guess I kind of like to connect that into the writing aspect, because a lot of our listeners right now, they're thinking about writing a book, or maybe they're writing a book. And of course, humor is something that resonates with all audiences. Everyone loves to laugh, but you were kind of cautioning us, like, there's a time and place for it. Some people pay you to listen to your jokes, other people aren't. So I'm wondering, when you're writing and when you're trying to put that onto the page, do you have any tips about, for our authors listening right now, how do you balance it, especially when you're writing about it, in terms of the context? What do you need to keep in mind in terms of the writing part? What do you
suppose think? I guess the thing that people say about one's writing, the thing that I like most when people say it, which they're very kindly sometimes do, is when they say, oh, I read it, sounds just like you. That's my favorite thing, because then you know that you're on the page and you're really explaining it the way that you want to explain it. Because one of the things I think that's difficult about writing is that there's a process between what's in your head and what's on the page. And what can happen is that can be mediated, especially when you're writing a book about something, a non-fiction book. I don't know about writing fiction. I've never written fiction, so I can't talk about that. But when you're writing a non-fiction book, there's a kind of process that can inhibit you and make you think that you've got to do it in a way that's sort of somehow formal and is not necessarily you. And I think the real joy when you get into the swing of it is when that filter's gone. And the thing about writing is, when people say to me, oh, how do you write a book? I say, you start. It's really simple. Yeah. Just write. And these days, and somebody, a great writer who I know, I won't say who it is, but gave me this fantastic, on computers these days, don't throw anything away. Because typically what people do is they write and then they delete and then they start. Don't do that. Keep everything you write. So in other words, write. You could always go back. Always go back. So what I'm saying, I guess, is that the judgment about humor when you're in the flow is not, in my experience, a conscious judgment about humor. It's the flow then simply demands the joke, if that's your means of expression. By the way, if you're not a funny person, don't try it.
That would distract from the book, of course, if it's a bad joke.
Well, sometimes bad jokes are great, but you know what I mean? If that's not your natural mode of expression, then don't kind of force yourself into it. In other words, there isn't a way to write it. The only way to write it is your way to write it. But I'm fascinated, for me, the thing that I have to get over is the filter. I have to get over that idea that I've got to do it in a formal sort of way. And the worst thing I do is I write sentences that are too long. And what Lucy Carter, my editor, was brilliant at doing was saying, actually, I think you'll find that's 3 sentences.
I get that a lot. Like clients come to me with their writing and then we got like a whole paragraph that's 1 sentence, right? You need to break up those run-on sentences. But, I'd like to kind of branch back to what you said. You said that, the key to writing humor or to writing any book is to just kind of, be yourself in that. So I guess in a way that's kind of your editor's job to take that, authentic self and your jokes that you're putting in and also kind of, I guess subduing it enough that it kind of weaves naturally into the text without being too much. Is that kind of what you were saying, that your editor had like a big role into playing?
Well, I think where they're really helpful, I think, is that the first thing you have to try and do if you're going to write a factual book, I mean, I'm sure this is true of fiction, I'll say this only once more, I don't know, but I can't talk about fiction because I don't know about it. If you're going to write a factual book, the thing for me is you have to kind of get a handle on, this sounds rather stupid, what you want to say, and important how that divides up. So the key for me is, I think, I know what I want. I got the title. I had the title without anything else. I knew that I wanted to write about this, the essential quality of diversity being about difference, not about similarity, about good disagreement, not about total agreement. I knew it was not about pointing and punishing, but it was about opening up discussions. So those are all the things that I wanted to say about diversity, but then I had to find a way of dividing it up. And what I think editors are very helpful in doing is doing that. They're very helpful in going, yeah, okay, well, you could do this, and, you know, helping you shape the argument. Because once you've got the broad shape, well, once I've got the broad shape, then I'm good to go. And then actually a lovely American journalist took one of my chats. I don't know why. I mean, we barely know each other. Bless him for doing it. This guy called Jesse Singal, who's a fantastic writer. And he, bless him, completely reorganized a chapter of mine. I sent it to him and he went, oh, well, I would do this, that, and you should move that to there. And suddenly it flowed. And the thing about that is, I think the first thing is write. The second thing is then the editor reads it and they write back 45 pages of notes, at which point you think, well, that's my career over. Turns out I'm an idiot. Turns out I can't write. Turns out the book is actually crap. You know, it's rubbish. And I'll just, you know, go away and drink myself into a bench on the park now.
Well, hopefully not.
But the point is, that's not true, but that's what it feels like to start with. So the next thing you do is, once you've written and you got it in some sort of shape, really, really use the critiques and the notes. Don't ever be frightened of an edit, unless it's a crap edit. If it's a bad editor, then it's annoying. And that's when people try and tell. What my editors, good editors, never do is they never ask you to say something you don't want to say. They help you to say what you want to say. Yeah. So what they're really good at doing is shaping it. That's their job. And always, always take their notes. You will want to disagree with some of them. You'll say, well, actually, no, that's not what I meant. I wanted to do this. So blah, blah. That's fine. But in general, try and not be defensive about the notes. Try and say to yourself, oh, hello. I'm like, that might improve it. And it almost always does. I've only written 2 books, but that was my real learning. And Lucy, the editor, was very clever at suggesting things that she thought, but she'd kind of make them almost feel like they were my idea. I'm not saying she's a deceptive and manipulative person who really oughtn't to be in public. I think she's wonderful. But she wasn't deceptive about that, but she had a diplomatic way of getting me to express myself even better. So I think edits and notes are fantastic, you know.
Yeah.
But you know, often people get very defensive about that, you know.
Of course, yeah. And you know, when you were talking about your point of like, don't be afraid of the editor's comments, don't get discouraged. That's an amazing tip that our listeners should bring home with them today after this episode. You know, like if especially it's your first time writing, you don't want to just lose that passion. You know, like you mentioned before, don't throw anything away, just keep writing, get your ideas out there. And the role of a good editor, I was going to say the same exact thing that, you know, what Lucy does is, you know, you don't just say, this is a bad paragraph. A good editor will offer you suggestions about, okay, let's rewrite it this way. This is what we can do. That's sort of, you know, I'm I guess an angel writer, also called a ghost writer here at Authors on Mission, but also an editor too. So as I'm editing a piece, a lot of the times I'll ghost write for my client as well and kind of be like, your paragraph's a little crazy right now, but here's a new version of it. You know, it's not that it's bad, but here's a new way to say it. So that's kind of, you know, the role of a great editor is, you know, allowing you to expand on it in a more clear way.
That's right. And often you don't see your own assumptions, do you? So you'll put something in and you realize, and the editor will go, hang on a second, when you say that, do you mean this? Because
right.
Actually, you haven't unpicked the assumption.
Helping to clarify. Yes.
And don't be afraid of repeating yourself. That's the other thing that I realized is that years ago, I mean, I worked and still work a lot on radio. And I used to present the arts programme on one of the BBC sort of speech station, Radio 4 as it's called. And the programme was called Kaleidoscope. And the first time I went off to see the Royal Shakespeare Company do Troilus and Cressida it was. And it was the first time I was, you know, presenting. And I was terrified. I thought, I don't know about Shakespeare. I can't stand Shakespeare. I don't know anything about it. This is terrible. Fortunately, I met an actor friend of mine on the train who said, oh, don't worry, it's all about love and war and you'll be fine. People kill each other and they fall in love and that's it. That's all you need to know. So that was like, oh, phew. He was in it, by the way. And then I met this fantastic professor whose name, unfortunately, I can't remember. But he said to me, oh, don't worry about Shakespeare. He repeats himself the whole time. because theatres were very noisy and people were standing up and wandering around and they were eating stuff and shouting and screaming at each other. So he repeats himself to get the point over. So he goes, the sky is blue, the sky is like your eyes, the sky is like the blue in the sea, because he goes on like that. And if you read Shakespeare, it's brilliant. He will embellish and repeat and whatever. And of course, the more he does it, the more beautiful it is. And you can see it with great storytellers. And if you watch comics, Billy Connolly or Richard Pryor or whatever, actually, if you watch it, they constantly elaborate on what they're doing. So what I'm saying is, when you write, don't just say a thing and expect everybody to understand it. Go round it. This point, and then that there, and then this there, and then you can look at it in this way. So just elaborate and remember that you're explaining something to people. That's a real help to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's another great tip for our listeners to hold on to as well, is, you want to be able to make sure that your points are expressed clearly and that you're fully, elaborating on what you're saying. However, I do want to argue that there is a, pretty delicate balance between being repetitive and explaining yourself, right? Especially with, I get a lot of manuscripts that people use AI to write, for example, and those things just repeat the same things. And I think it's a difference between saying the same things in another way and repeating yourself, but expanding on it is another difference. So I guess that's another balance.
Expanding on it's a good way to put it. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, don't write in shorthand. Take trouble to explain the angles and the reflections. And whenever you're doing something, you're turning it around. You're turning it around in the light. I mean, that's why in the book, each chapter begins with a historical story of some sort. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm trying to go into a subject in a way that's oblique, so that you're trying to lead people into what I hope is a more interesting, so you go, here's this story about Oscar Wilde, or here's this thing about great man history theory, or whatever. There's one which I love, which is all about the heroic leader. And it's all about a guy who won a VC called Johnson V. Harry. VC is the Victoria Cross. It's the highest medal for gallantry in the UK, military gallantry. And, it's the story about him in Iraq. And I mean, he's kind of courageous and mad. I mean, you read this thing, you go, really? You did that twice? Mad. But the point about the story is, it's really what I was trying to do was set up this idea of what are heroes, what do they mean for us? And how do we use them in our mythology and our language? Because what I wanted to think about was leadership. So that's what I mean about trying to elaborate on things. If you can think of ways of giving people a different way of getting into a subject, that will engage them, which enables you then to start playing with it.
Okay, yeah, no, I understand what you mean completely. And, that's an amazing point that you made, because you need to make sure your ideas are getting across clearly, that the audience understands what you mean. And that's the only way that people are going to continue reading your book and picking it up off the shelves. But speaking of your book, I think we should kind of segue into your actual book. And there it is right there. You got that cue. Do you mind holding it up for us one more time for our listeners to say The Power of Difference? Everybody, you could pick it up at your bookstores on Amazon. It's amazing story, and I'm glad that we're going to dive into more of the details of that right now. My first question for you about your book specifically is something you kind of brought up earlier, is that you didn't necessarily want to write it. You were asked to write it, which is something that's different than a lot of the people I talk to on this podcast. Most people are inspired by something, they want to write about it. They find a need for a topic that needs to be written about, and that's why they write about it. But for you, you were kind of just going about, your own path, and you were approached and asked to write this. So I wonder, was it a challenge to kind of put together what on earth you wanted to say in that book? You mentioned the importance of outlining your thoughts before starting. How did you approach this, being that you never expected to write it in the first place?
I will say I love writing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I really do. I love it. I get completely lost in it. And so all writers will know this. It's very consuming and it's great. I mean, it's just a very good thing to do, and you end up sitting in the same position and you can't, when you stand up, you can't walk. It's great. The other thing I should say about the book, that I did write it during the COVID lockdown. Mm. So I had been asked to write it, blah, blah, blah. And then, well, hello, I've got nothing else to do now. So I'll write it. It was beautiful weather. We lived near the sea. So I'd write from sort of 10 till 4 and then go on a bike ride and maybe swim in the sea and whatever. So it was a very lovely thing to do. But I think the being asked to do it is the help to get over the fear of doing it.
Fear of getting started, the fear of criticism, just kind of getting started, right?
I mean, writing a book's a big thing. I mean, this is 250 pages long, for crying out loud. You know what I mean? It's like, really? Do that? I think that's scary. But it's not to do it. It's scary to think about it. You know? So once I dived into it, I really, really loved it because I just thought it was fun. Getting it organized, that's key for me, because then you know what you're writing about in each different bit. I don't know how people write fiction, because what I find absolutely fantastic about fiction is the fiction writers always talk about this, the way the characters literally take on a life of their own. I find that an intriguing idea. I think that's absolutely fascinating. You can work up the idea of a character in your head and they start to do things. And I think that's an amazing idea. But it was much more to do with, I like ideas when they jump from across different disciplines, or they jump into different contexts. They jump from history to sociology that's the way I think, and I like joining the dots in that way. So the idea of trying to find patterns and those sort of things I find really interesting. So what did I do? I got the shape, and then each chapter I just read actually a lot to start with, because I was looking at this because I needed to get some research. I need to get my head around the research. And what you have to be careful there is, don't just read one research paper and think, oh, fantastic, that'll do. Box ticked on that. You know, you really do need to read around. So you need to read stuff which comes from a position that you suspect you'll disagree with. Fantastic. Go for that. Challenge your thinking. So be really careful about, when you do thread things together, be really careful that they can be threaded together. You know? What else did I do? The research was fun. I just read actually. And when you read, oh, by the way, when you read, take notes really carefully, because otherwise you won't remember the page that you do that. So right. I just do page, and I endlessly do page 9, and I have a pencil in other books and whatever they are.
Yeah. So what was your method for that? Did you kind of like put post-it notes within the book, or was it more of like a Kindle version that you were?
I do highlighters, and then on the laptop I type page 9, and then I just put a little note. And then sometimes obviously research you can search again, because if it's online it's PDFs and whatever. But no, I tend to just or pencil. I do pencils in books. Shouldn't really write in a book, but I love writing in a book. When I was
that's kind of a well-loved book is when it's written and dog-eared and all that. So that's how
I do it. So yeah, I go through and then I underline stuff, and then often what happens is just one sentence will spark somebody else's sentence, will spark a whole idea, and that's a great moment. That's like, and then that opens a door to another avenue of thinking.
Yeah, another great tip for our listeners today is that, not beyond just, being yourself, getting started in the writing, but also researching and knowing what you're going to be talking about, having a full understanding of it so you can explain it like you were mentioning before. And I like that you talked about how it's important to just kind of start reading, mark it up, take those notes. In terms of organization and the process of doing that, for our audience's purposes, you mentioned that you use hard copies, you highlight it, you take notes. How do you know sort of what books you're going to start with? Like where even do you begin in terms of researching?
Well, I suppose there's an awful lot of research around this subject area, diversity and inclusion. But my sense was, you think, well, where does diversity and inclusion come from? So one of the things I would say to people is, you're going to write about, I don't know, whatever you're going to write about. What's the root of that stuff? This stuff doesn't exist in isolation. So ideas come from other ideas. So the thing that I was really interested in is I wanted to understand what is the development of ideas that ends up talking about diversity and inclusion. Where did that start? Well, it starts with the Enlightenment. It starts with this idea that you can use language and knowledge to articulate a set of what they called rights, the rights of man and all that. You could actually use rational thought to understand and establish the way societies would work. That's an extraordinary notion. So if you go back to that, and then you realize that you go through, and then you end up with the civil rights movement, you start looking at, the various kind of community rights, you look at black civil rights, gay civil rights, women's suffrage and whatever. you know, and a lot of it comes from that notion of universal rights. So I was really interested in that. So then I went off and read books about that, you know, because I wanted to understand a bit about how did that develop. And then obviously you've got, you know, the United Nations after the war, so that makes you think about anti-Semitism, it makes you think about the Holocaust. So how did that change our view of rights? So you, for me, I wanted to build up a picture. So even if I did in the end put this in the book, but I didn't necessarily intend to, I just wanted to have an idea. Because the thing about the danger of this EDI stuff and DEIB and DEI and IED and all these acronyms that people load diversity and inclusion about, is that people speak about it as if it's a thing of itself and as if it's new. Well, it's not new. Human difference, it turns out, is kind of quite an old idea. It's kind of been around since humans.
And by nature.
Yeah, so, you know, there's lots of I've got a colleague who calls them busy fools. Lots of people running around, terribly busy, terribly busy, terribly busy, and they're doing all this DEI stuff, and it makes no difference to anybody anywhere. What I wanted to do was say, what's going to make the real difference? You know, how do we understand it? So your question was, what books did I read?
Like sort of your path, you know, like, and you kind of explained that a little bit already, sort of. You started in one place, you got inspired by a particular passage in that, and then that led you to another avenue, picking up another book until you eventually formulated the concepts that you put into your book, which, you know, ended up being sort of the diversity dividend and, you know, all the other concepts that you threw in there. So continue that.
I had a history teacher, Oliver Ramsbottom, who became, and still is actually in his 80s, an international expert on conflict resolution, and he ran the Peace Studies Centre at Bradford University. He's an absolutely fantastic man, and he was my history teacher at school, and I love him dearly, and he's a very good friend still, which is bizarre because he's known me since I was 13. And he had this great thing he used to say to us. He'd say two things: question the provenance of evidence. And he would use the Doomsday Book. I don't know whether you know what the Doomsday Book is, but the Doomsday Book was a collection of information in the 11th century in Britain about who owned what land. Okay? And it was used for taxation when taxation was being invented. But the Doomsday was a very famous thing in British history. Okay, and Oliver used to say, who wrote the Doomsday Book, and what did they want you to know? Question the provenance of evidence. Don't just take it. And the second thing he'd say is, then formulate an argument. So gather the thinking and then turn it into an argument. And I've always remembered that. So for me, those two things have been very, very strong. So read, but actually question. Who's telling me this? What perspective is it coming from? How's that therefore formulating it? And then secondly, now how do I formulate that into an argument, which may involve competing viewpoints, because that's what you want the reader to do, is experience the dialectic, the contrast.
Yeah, understood. I mean, it's amazing that you think about, you know, you're reading a book, but you have to think about the purpose and why it was written, and that's kind of what drove your own writing in itself. And I guess I can see how for you the outlining and the planning of this book was, you know, a pretty big task, because you had to come up with these ideas based on your own theories, but also you were, you know, kind of allowing it to be influenced by other works too, which I think is an amazing thing for all authors to consider, right? You know, you're not just putting your own ideas on paper in order to make it authentic and, you know, really grab the attention of your audience, is to have viewpoints from all the different people. And I guess that's sort of what you did in your book by doing this research. Would that be correct?
Never write I think.
You have to be certain, confident.
Frankly, who cares? When I was a journalist, a feature writer for many, many years, and on the Sunday Times, and the then editor of the Sunday Times, he always would say, well, the thing is, so what, SW. He added an F, by the way, so it's SFW, and I'm not going to repeat the F on the author.
I think we can fill in the blank.
But I think I has no real place in a book. If you're trying to describe things for other people to read, because who cares what you think? What you're trying to do is raise thoughts for them. So you're trying to exchange thoughts with the reader. So you're sort of saying I think the whole time, but what you're really doing is saying, here's a bunch of information, here's a bunch of stuff, and what that seems to be saying is the following. So therefore what? So you're giving it to the audience the whole time rather than keeping it to yourself.
Right. You know, it's interesting. I think, you know, when I was in, not to say I think myself, but when I was in college, one of my professors, I remember he told me, like, your writing by nature is coming from you. So you don't need to use the term I think, because the audience knows that you're the one writing it, right? It's kind of redundant to say. So I understand what you mean. Present the idea and show how all of those facts, whatever it is that lead up to the idea, prove that. So I like that.
And also, the other thing that my business partner did a fantastic thing. He read the proofs, the first set of proofs. And so he sat in the corner of the room. It took 2 days to do this, or 2 half days. He sat in the corner of the room and he read it. And then he'd go, okay, page whatever. And he'd give me a sentence and I'd search for it. Mm-hmm. And the things he picked up on a lot were when I assumed that everybody reading thought X, Y, or Z. And Roy would go, hang on, I don't think that. So when you said everybody thinks, or not, I mean, I wouldn't say that, but I would assume, I would imply that this was commonly held thought. And Roy would go, well, I don't think it. That would stop him reading, because he'd go, hang on, no, that's not right. So he constantly helped me to broaden that access for the reader, so that you weren't shutting them out by assuming what they thought. You were opening up the thoughts of them. That was a fantastic process to go through. So if you can find somebody who can do that, question what you're assuming, that's really helpful. I mean, it's an editor's task, but he did it particularly brilliantly. It was very generous with it.
I agree with that completely. At Authors on Mission, we have a whole team of people. So when you're working with us, it's not just you and your editor. You're also talking to our strategists, our marketing, our designers, you know what I mean? So you get multiple perspectives of your book. And, even if you're not working with a group of people or a company, even having a friend or a business partner, like you said, read over your book is always an incredible idea, because you need to know how different groups of people are going to perceive your writing, right, and what they're going to get from it. So that's
quite simply, you say everybody loves the bacon sandwich,
but that's might not be true.
but there's no need to be precious about it. But the point is, that's not true. You know what I mean? And the Jewish person sitting there with their yarmulke on is going to stop going on. They don't. So what you're doing is you're interrupting that interaction with the reader, rather than inviting them into something where they can be part of, or not part of, and you acknowledge they're not part of it.
Understood. So, amazing tips that we've shared so far. A lot of things that I think are going to really help our listeners kind of shape their own writing too, going from just not getting over the fear of criticism, to incorporating humor, to, working with a team of people. All of these are amazing things, the research as well. Now I'm going to kind of ask you a question about, yourself and your own sort of paths right now. What's next for you? You've written this book, you've been consulting, what's next on your journey now that you have?
Well, there are a couple of things. One is that in the field that I work in, so working with companies and organizations on questions of diversity and inclusion, there is a reset going on. There's what you lovely Americans call a vibe shift.
Okay.
And people keep on saying to me, what's the vibe shift? Because all of these companies, Ford, Meta, whatever, saying we're not going to do EDI any longer. I think what's going on is they're not rejecting the core objectives of equality and diversity and inclusion. What they're resisting is the methods that have grown up around it. It's the ways of doing it. So that what has happened is that a set of orthodoxies have grown up around diversity and inclusion. And what I'm interested in doing now is going back to the beginnings, the core. What are we really trying to do here? Well, what we're trying to do is unblock blocks to talent, so that people can fulfill to their full potential, whatever that might be. And you're looking at those blocks to talent either for individuals or for groups of people. And current orthodoxy of EDI has got too far into thinking group experience is homogenous, white, black, male, female, toxic masculinity, women. These binaries are not helping us. They're not acknowledging progress. They're dampening argument and the exchange of ideas, and it's becoming dangerous. It's becoming restrictive, a set of prohibitions and rules, rather than an unleashing of talent. And the other thing we're trying to do is, once you've unleashed the talent and removed the blocks, how do you combine it to pursue common aims? Back to my point about the big principle and collaboration through difference. So all that's in the book, and all that's, I think, more and more important, that we really start to reject some of these very prohibitive ways of pursuing diversity and inclusion. So what I want to write is, I want to try and find a way of writing about that, really. And I want to find a way of writing about it in terms of the exchange of ideas, in terms of freedom, in terms of, well, I wanted to call the book, The First Person to Call You a Nazi Loses the Argument.
Okay, that would definitely grab people's attention right away.
Yeah, I don't think, unfortunately, anybody particularly wants a book on the shelves with the word Nazi in it. I do appreciate that. But what I'm trying to say is we used to be in a situation where you'd say, I disagree with you. I think I'm right. I think you're wrong. Now what people say is, I think I'm right. I think you're evil.
Right.
That is a damaging place for us to be. And I think it's damaging particularly for those of us who think of themselves as liberals. So if you look at your recent election, big elements of that was the Democrats imposing a set of things, a set of views on people, telling them they couldn't think that, their anxieties about change and whatever was racist or bigoted or this, that, the other. So what I'm interested in is where does liberalism need to get to in order to open up discussions again, so we can acknowledge fears of with each other, and then we can find dialogue with each other. So I kind of want to write something about that. And I want to do it in a way that takes some of the experiences that I've had. So I want to hang it to some extent on, I'm quite interested in how I've ended up thinking what I think. So I sort of quite like telling the stories about childhood upbringing. I quite like those because they sort of help, they're an autobiographical way of explaining a more general thought. So I'm toying with the idea, I don't want to write a memoir, by the way. Who the hell wants to read Fanny's, my nickname at school was Fanny. Who wants to read Fanny's memoirs? Nobody. But what I think they might want to read is a book about how do we recreate that tolerance, that sense of exchange of ideas. I mean, the things that are great that have happened to me. So in the 80s, I mentioned this in the book, but I was beaten around the head intellectually in the 80s and 70s by feminists. And they gave me such a hard time. And it's one of the best gifts in my life. And I love that because the challenge and the exchange of difference was extraordinary. So I kind of want to take this to the next phase and think, well, what do we need to be thinking about, in the next period, really? But I don't know. As you can hear from me waffling on, it's all a bit unformed at the moment.
Well, that's how every book starts, is a little bit unformed, right? But, I think it's interesting that you kind of discredited memoirs, because I think a lot of books that are, popular and, are very well received is when you're talking about your own experiences. So I see what you mean. And, you don't want the whole book to be, your life from, birth to death or something. But there's a true value in writing about your experiences and then relating it into the content of your book or the point you wish to get across, which is exactly what I think you like to do there. And what's interesting is you mentioned before about how your current book starts with stories, but they're more historical. So it would be interesting to see how your next book could potentially start with your personal stories and how that shaped your thoughts, and then leading that into each chapter. That's an interesting way to think about it and to organize it.
Yes, I suppose what I'm saying about the memoir thing is that I think when people tell, the dullest autobiographies are when people just tell the story and, they got up in the morning and we had coffee and then Sally and I had an argument and, so it goes on, and you think, well, if this was Proust, it'd be fine, but it's not, but what all those stories have to do, it seems to me, is illustrate something which is beyond you. So they've always got to be illustrating something that's an encounter, a phenomenon, an understanding, an insight. So that's what one's trying to do. And I quite like the idea of peppering it with other people's insights and quotes and cartoons and maybe do something like that. I don't know, it's all over the place. It's a sort of waste paper basket of ideas at the moment. So stop asking me.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if I'll stop asking you. But if you're, I'll stop. But if you if you're ever interested in kind of, bringing that to life, I mean, you said it yourself, you kind of just have to get started, don't be afraid to just, start piling all those ideas into a basket, and then, looking at it yourself, or even have somebody else, look at it for you and say, like, okay, how can we take this and structure it in a way that can be a book one day, right? It's, you said it yourself, get started, so.
And I think one of the things one can do is you can, when you write non-fiction, I think it's quite easy to get somehow overloaded with the responsibility of the importance of the subject. Because you think these are big ideas, these big things. I better be right. I better say something hugely kind of momentous and significant. Actually, probably not. I mean, there's very few people in the world who've ever written something that's truly original. What we're doing is we're trying to draw things together in a way that's interesting and stimulates some thoughts. So I think that's also a thing too. It's how one can make it a bit tasty and a bit delicious and a bit nibblesome.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely have a delicious book written by you, but I see where you're going with that. I mean, honestly, you have an amazing way of, taking really serious topics, making it fun, making it relatable, not being afraid to talk about it. Beginning of this podcast, you mentioned how when you were growing up, somebody asked you, like, if the point is to stop talking about it, why do you keep talking about it? And I think that's incredible that you took that and you kind of formulated it into this whole approach that you have in your life and in your books and everything. So really admirable there.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think a lot of our listeners today, they'd be very interested in reading your book and learning more about you and what you do. So, after this podcast, where can they find more information about you? Do you have a website you'd like to share with us that they can kind of,
there is one. There's two actually. One is there is simonfanshawe.com, which I don't populate very much, but I do do a little bit of that. And then, so if people want to contact me, please do get in touch because it's there, and you can find ways of getting the book. The other one is that the company we run is called Diversity by Design. And if people are interested in the work on that, we're just actually about to go through a whole kind of redo of it. So if you've got criticisms of it, keep them to yourself because we're just about to do it. But so that's it. But I mean, if you fancy the book, then please have a look. Tell me what you think and get in touch. I mean, I'm often on LinkedIn. I tend to read Twitter more than do Twitter, if you see what I mean. I tend not to say very much on Twitter except when I'm trying to push an idea. Because what is it somebody once described Twitter as, like everybody you hate having your phone number.
Right.
It's like, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, look, just get in touch with me, and it's extremely kind of you to have given me the opportunity to share some rather raggedy thoughts. So thanks.
Yeah. I mean, we'll put those links within the description of this video and this podcast so everybody can, get a hold of you and learn more about your work. So I think it's really important that they do because, not only do you have amazing insights about writing itself, but I think that anybody listening today could benefit from some of your other ideas and strategies that are within your other content too.
Great. And if there are, in a corporate context, obviously context, we have a lot of corporate clients and we do work with multinationals, but we haven't worked much in America. But if there are listeners all over the world and your organization, if you think you can benefit from our kind of what I hope are refreshing insights in EDIDEIBINDDNI, whatever the hell you call it, you're not acronym hell. But whatever you're doing there, if you think you can benefit from these kind of ideas, then get in touch. It'd be lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, it only takes a couple clicks to get in touch. So go ahead and do that, everybody. And, Simon, thank you so much for joining us today. I think your insights have really benefited everybody listening, including myself. And it's been a wonderful discussion. So thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for asking me. It's been a real delight. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, of course. And to all of our listeners today, thank you also for being a part of another episode of Authors on Mission. Simon Fanshawe's experiences from comedy to activism to consulting, it really demonstrates how, if we just embrace our diversities rather than just demanding conformity, it really just creates lasting change. So I think you have an amazing practical approach in a lighthearted way to get these ideas across. And I think we've had a lot of valuable lessons in today's podcast. So to all of our listeners, take that to heart, do your homework and pick up those books written by Simon as well. And you can join us next time as we continue helping leaders just like yourself transform their knowledge into impact through the written word. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. And until next time, keep writing, keep leading, and keep inspiring. Have a great day. This is Danielle Hutchinson reminding you that somewhere, someone needs the book that only you can write. Visit authorsonmission.com to start your legacy. Until next time, keep leading, keep inspiring, and keep thinking in chapters. Have a great day.